Some transformations don't show on the outside, yet they change everything. This is a story about a man who spent 32 years hiding. Not from the world, exactly, but from himself. A man who wore armor so convincing that even he forgot what lay beneath it. A man named Daniel, whose life was about to shift in ways he never imagined possible. But to understand how he got there, to understand the moment when everything finally broke open and light flooded in, we need to start from yesterday, from the day before the interview, from the moment when pretending became too exhausting to continue, because this isn't just a story about getting a job. It's about what happens when we finally stop performing and start living. Daniel stood in front of his bathroom mirror, tie in hand, trying to remember how to breathe. The interview was tomorrow, the biggest opportunity of his career. Senior project manager at a firm that could change everything. The salary, the respect, the validation he'd been chasing since college. Everything he'd worked for was one conversation away. So why did he feel like he was drowning? He tried practicing his answers again, tried summoning that confident, decisive energy that interview panels wanted to see. But every word felt hollow. Every gesture felt mechanical. He was watching himself perform, and the performance was failing. Daniel wasn't weak. Let's be clear about that from the start. He was intelligent, capable, deeply talented at what he did. He had the skills, he had the experience. On paper, he was the perfect candidate. But paper doesn't capture what it feels like to live in a body that doesn't match your soul. Paper doesn't show the exhaustion of wearing a mask every single day. Paper doesn't reveal the parts of yourself you've been taught to bury so deep that even you forget they exist. Daniel had spent over a decade building what he thought was strength. The firm handshake, the steady voice, the squared shoulders, the way he dressed, moved, spoke. All of it carefully constructed to project a version of masculinity that the world would accept, that the world would reward. And it had worked, to a degree. He had a decent job. He had respect from colleagues. He had a beautiful wife who loved him. From the outside, everything looked fine. But from the inside, Daniel felt like he was disappearing. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from denying your true self. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It's not dramatic. It's more like a slow erosion, a quiet draining of color from your world, until one day you wake up and realize you can't remember the last time you felt truly alive. Daniel couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started. Maybe it was in childhood, when he first learned that certain expressions were for girls, and certain interests were wrong for boys like him. Maybe it was in high school, when he carefully edited every gesture to avoid the mockery that came with being different. Maybe it was in college, when he chose his major based on what seemed respectable rather than what made his heart sing. Or maybe it was all of those moments, layered upon each other, year after year, until the weight became so familiar he forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. The truth was, Daniel had another side, a softer side, an expressive side, a part of him that found beauty in things the world told him he wasn't supposed to appreciate, a part that felt more comfortable, more authentic, more genuinely him than the masculine armor he wore every day. This wasn't about wanting to be someone else. It wasn't about rejecting masculinity entirely. It was about the simple, terrifying truth that Daniel felt most like himself when he allowed his feminine energy to breathe, when he let go of rigidity and embraced fluidity, when he stopped performing strength and simply existed. But that part of him had been locked away for so long, hidden in a box, both literal and metaphorical, pushed down every time it tried to surface, denied every time it whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to be. And now, standing in his bathroom trying to prepare for the most important interview of his life, Daniel felt that hidden part of himself crying out, demanding to be acknowledged, refusing to stay silent any longer. He looked at his reflection and barely recognized the person staring back. The face was his. The body was his. But the energy, the presence, that felt like a stranger. A performance, a lie he'd been telling for so long, he'd almost convinced himself it was true. Almost. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands. His practice notes were scattered around him, each page filled with the right answers to potential interview questions, leadership examples, project successes, confident statements about his vision and capabilities. All of it technically true, all of it completely hollow. His wife, Sadie, had been watching him spiral for hours. She knew him better than anyone, knew the person he showed the world and the person he truly was, knew the weight he carried and the sacrifice he made every single day to be acceptable. She'd always loved all of him, not just the parts he felt safe showing, not just the masculine presentation he wore like a uniform, but the whole person. The complex, multifaceted, beautifully contradictory human being she'd fallen in love with. And now, watching him fracture under the pressure of pretending, her heart broke for him. Daniel finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. He told her what he'd been feeling. The disconnect. The exhaustion. The sense that he was losing himself piece by piece. He admitted that he didn't know how to walk into that interview as the person they expected him to be, because that person felt more foreign to him than ever. He confessed something he'd barely allowed himself to think, that there was another version of himself, a softer version, a more feminine version, that used to give him confidence, that used to make him feel powerful in a way the masculine performance never could. But he'd buried that version years ago, convinced it was something to be ashamed of. What if it means I'm not enough, he asked, not really expecting an answer. What if the real me isn't what the world wants? It was the question that had haunted him for years. The fear that kept the box locked. The belief that acceptance meant conformity and authenticity meant rejection. But Sade saw things differently. She always had. She reminded him of who he was before the armor, before the mask, before he learned to hide. She reminded him of the person who used to light up when expressing himself freely, who used to move through the world with a different kind of confidence, not the forced, rigid strength of traditional masculinity, but something more fluid, more genuine, more deeply rooted in self-acceptance. She told him something revolutionary, that his strength wasn't in hiding, it was in embracing, that the confidence he was searching for wouldn't come from perfecting his masculine performance, it would come from honoring all the parts of himself he'd been taught to deny. And then she made a suggestion that terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure. What if, just for tonight, he let that hidden side emerge? What if he opened the box he'd kept locked for years? What if he allowed himself to express the feminine energy that had always been part of him? Just to remember what it felt like. Not to become someone different, but to reconnect with someone he'd always been. Daniel's first instinct was resistance. Years of conditioning don't dissolve easily. The voice in his head immediately offered 1,000 reasons why this was dangerous. What if someone found out? What if it made him weaker? What if it confirmed all his fears that he was somehow wrong, somehow broken, somehow not man enough? But beneath the fear was something else. Something quieter, but more insistent. A small voice that had been waiting years to be heard. A voice that whispered, yes. Transformation doesn't always start loud. Sometimes it begins with a whisper to yourself. It's okay. Daniel stood in their spare room, hands trembling slightly, staring at a storage box he hadn't opened in nearly 5 years. Inside were items that represented a version of himself he'd locked away. Makeup, soft fabrics, accessories that felt more true to his spirit than any tie or blazer ever had. For years, this box had been both a comfort and a source of shame. Comfort, because he knew it was there if he ever found the courage. Shame, because its very existence felt like evidence of his failure to be what he was supposed to be. But tonight, guided by Sade's love and his own desperate need for authenticity, Daniel made a choice. He opened the box. The first item he pulled out was a soft, flowing shirt in a deep purple. He remembered buying it years ago, how it had made him feel seen in a way masculine clothing never did. He held it for a long moment, feeling the fabric between his fingers, remembering what it was like to dress for himself rather than for the world's expectations. Then, slowly, he began. This wasn't about cross-dressing in the way people might imagine. This wasn't about performing femininity the way he'd been performing masculinity. This was about integration, about allowing different energies to coexist, about expressing himself in ways that felt natural rather than prescribed. He put on the purple shirt, then added accessories that spoke to his aesthetic sense, applied subtle makeup that enhanced rather than disguised. With each item, each small act of self-expression, something inside him began to shift. The armor was coming off, the mask was falling away, and underneath was someone he recognized, someone he'd missed desperately without quite realizing it. When he finally looked in the mirror, really looked, something unexpected happened. He smiled. It wasn't the practiced smile he wore for professional photos. It wasn't the confident grin he forced before presentations. It was genuine, unguarded, real. For the first time in months, maybe years, Daniel felt like himself. Sade found him standing there, tears streaming down his face, smiling at his own reflection. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. Her presence, her acceptance, her unwavering support said everything. She simply stood beside him and smiled too. They spent the evening together in that quiet, sacred space. Daniel didn't perform, didn't explain, didn't justify, he simply existed as the whole, complete version of himself. Masculine and feminine. Strong and soft. All of it integrated, all of it real, all of it valid. And something remarkable happened. The anxiety that had been choking him for weeks began to dissolve. The desperate, frantic energy of trying to be enough by being something he wasn't, it simply evaporated. In its place came a different kind of confidence, not the loud, aggressive confidence of forced masculinity, but a quieter, deeper assurance. The confidence that comes from self-acceptance. The strength that emerges when you stop fighting yourself and start honoring who you truly are. Sada told him something important that night. Take this feeling with you tomorrow. Not the clothes, not the external expression, but this energy, this sense of being whole. This is the confidence they need to see. Because here's what Daniel was beginning to understand. Authenticity is magnetic. When you show up as your full self, not a performance, not a mask, but the genuine integrated person you actually are, people sense it. They might not be able to name it, but they feel it. They're drawn to it. All those years of trying to project confidence through masculine performance had actually undermined his natural charisma, because people can sense when you're performing. They can feel the disconnection between your words and your energy. They can detect inauthenticity even when they can't consciously identify it. But when you show up whole, when you allow all your energies, masculine and feminine, strong and vulnerable, confident and humble, to coexist naturally, that's when you become truly powerful. That night, for the first time in years, Daniel slept peacefully. No anxiety dreams. No rehearsing answers in his sleep. Just deep, restful sleep. The sleep of someone who's finally stopped running from themselves. When Daniel woke the next morning, something was different. He dressed in a suit, wore a tie. Presented, from the outside, in a traditionally masculine way. The interview required professional attire, and he understood that. This wasn't about rejecting masculine expression entirely. This was about integration, not replacement. But here's what had changed. He wasn't wearing armor anymore. He wasn't performing. He was simply dressed. The suit fit the same way it always had, but he wore it differently. His shoulders were relaxed rather than rigidly squared. His movements were more fluid. His energy was calmer, more grounded, more genuinely confident. He looked in the mirror one last time before leaving, and the man looking back was someone he recognized. Not the hollow performer, not the exhausted pretender, but himself. His whole self. Masculine presentation infused with feminine energy. Strong and soft, confident and open. This was integration. The drive to the interview was different too. No frantic reviewing of notes, no rehearsing answers, no desperate attempts to pump himself up or manufacture confidence. He simply drove, present and calm, carrying with him the energy of self-acceptance he'd reconnected with the night before. When he walked into the building, his steps were steady, not because he was forcing confidence, but because he wasn't fighting himself anymore. And that made all the difference. The interview panel consisted of 3 people, 2 senior managers and the department director. They asked the expected questions. Leadership examples, problem-solving scenarios, vision for the role. All the standard inquiries designed to assess competence and fit. But something unusual happened. Daniel answered with a quality that surprised even himself. His responses were confident, yes, but not in the aggressive, domineering way masculine business culture often demands. Instead, his confidence was laced with vulnerability. He spoke about failures and learning, about collaboration rather than individual heroics, about emotional intelligence alongside technical skill. He brought his whole self into those answers. The masculine qualities the business world valued: decisiveness, strategic thinking, leadership, but softened and enriched by feminine energies. Empathy, intuition, relational awareness, the ability to hold complexity rather than forcing simplistic solutions. The panel noticed. How could they not? One of the managers leaned forward, genuinely engaged in a way that's rare in interviews. The director took more notes than usual, and in the brief moments between questions, Daniel caught something in their expressions. Recognition. Not of a performance, but of authenticity. They were seeing someone real, someone whole, someone who didn't match the typical template, and that was exactly what made him stand out. There's a quality that exceptional leaders have, though it's rarely named directly. It's the ability to integrate seeming opposites, to be strong yet humble, confident yet open, decisive yet collaborative, to hold traditionally masculine and traditionally feminine energies in balance. Most candidates try to present one-dimensional strength, but the truly remarkable ones, the ones who transform organizations and inspire teams, they show up whole. And for the first time in his professional life, Daniel was showing up whole. When the interview ended, the panel thanked him with a warmth that felt different from the polite dismissals he'd experienced before. There was something in their eyes, a spark of recognition, a sense that they'd just encountered someone unusual in the best possible way. But as Daniel left the building, doubt began creeping back in. The walk to his car felt longer than it should have. With every step, the confidence he'd carried into the interview started to fade, replaced by the old familiar fear. Had he been too vulnerable? Too soft? Had his authentic self been too different from what they expected? Maybe they wanted the traditional masculine performance after all. Maybe his integration read as confusion. Maybe being himself wasn't enough. The drive home was heavy with uncertainty. Daniel replayed moments from the interview, analyzing every response, looking for mistakes. The old patterns of self-doubt came flooding back, eroding the sense of peace he'd felt that morning. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd almost convinced himself that authenticity had been a mistake, that he should have stuck with the performance, that being real was too risky in a world that rewarded conformity. He entered his home quietly, exhaustion settling into his bones. Not the physical tiredness from a long day, but the deep soul weariness that comes from hope mixed with fear, from risk mixed with vulnerability. Sade was there, watching him, seeing all the doubt written across his face. But she didn't ask how it went. She simply waited, giving him space to feel whatever he needed to feel. Daniel removed his shoes slowly, methodically, as if each action required tremendous effort. He loosened his tie, set down his bag, moved through the mundane actions of arriving home while his mind spun with anxiety and second-guessing. And then the phone rang. Time seemed to slow down. Daniel stared at his phone, watching it vibrate, seeing the unknown number on the screen. His heart hammered, his hands trembled. Sade watched silently, holding her breath. He answered. The voice on the other end was warm, professional, direct. Human resources. They thanked him for coming in, complimented his interview, and then said the words that would change everything. Congratulations, Daniel. You were exceptional today. You got the job. Silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a moment so significant that words become inadequate. The silence before transformation becomes real. Daniel's knees gave out. Not from weakness, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of validation. Not just validation for his professional skills, though that mattered, but validation for a deeper risk he'd taken. The risk of showing up whole. The risk of being authentically himself. They hadn't wanted the performance. They'd wanted him. The real him. All of him. He thanked them, somehow found words to accept the offer, ended the call. And then he simply sat on the floor, overwhelmed with emotion, relief, joy, disbelief, gratitude, all of it washing over him in waves too big to contain. Sade knelt beside him, tears in her own eyes, holding him while he processed what had just happened. After a while, minutes or hours, Daniel couldn't tell. He stood, moved through his home with a new kind of purpose. Not frantic energy, but something calmer, something final. He walked to his closet and pulled out his suit jacket. The jacket he'd worn to the interview, the jacket that had represented all those years of armor, of performance, of pretending to be something he wasn't. He looked at it for a long moment. This piece of clothing had been both protection and prison. It had helped him survive in a world that demanded conformity, but it had also cost him years of authentic living. He didn't need it anymore. Daniel walked to the trash bin, and without ceremony, without drama, he let the jacket fall from his hands. Not because he was rejecting masculinity, not because he was declaring war on traditional male expression, but because he was releasing the part of himself that had lived in fear, the part that believed acceptance required hiding, the part that thought survival meant denying half of who he was. The jacket wasn't the enemy. Fear was. Inauthenticity was. The belief that he had to choose between masculine and feminine, between strength and softness, between being accepted and being real. He didn't have to choose anymore. He could be whole. He could integrate all of his energies, all of his expressions, all of the complex, beautiful, contradictory elements that made him who he was. And the world hadn't rejected him for it. The world had rewarded him, not despite his authenticity, but because of it. Here's what Daniel learned that night, and what perhaps all of us need to understand. True confidence doesn't come from perfecting a performance. It comes from self-acceptance, from honoring all the parts of yourself, even the ones that don't fit neatly into society's boxes. Especially those parts. For years, Daniel had believed that success required him to be one-dimensional, to emphasize his masculine traits and suppress his feminine ones, to project traditional strength and hide anything that might be perceived as weakness. But that approach had only made him weaker, because when you're fighting yourself, when you're using all your energy to maintain a mask, you have nothing left for genuine presence, for authentic connection, for the kind of confidence that actually moves people and changes outcomes. The version of himself he'd been hiding, the softer, more expressive, more feminine side, wasn't a liability, it was a strength. Not in spite of his masculine qualities, but in integration with them. This is true for all of us, regardless of our gender or expression. We all contain multitudes. We all have energies and traits that don't fit neatly into the categories society has created. And we all face the choice between performing what's expected and embodying what's true. Daniel had chosen truth, and truth, it turned out, was magnetic. The interview panel hadn't been looking for another cookie-cutter candidate. They'd been looking for someone real, someone with depth, someone who could bring both strength and vulnerability, both decisiveness and empathy, both confidence and humility. They'd been looking for integration, even if they couldn't name it. And when Daniel showed up whole, when he stopped performing and started simply being, they recognized what they'd been searching for. That evening, Daniel and Sade celebrated, not with a big party or grand gestures, but in the quiet, sacred way that honors genuine transformation. They danced in their living room to soft music, they laughed, they cried, they held each other in gratitude for this moment, this breakthrough, this beginning of something new, because that's what this was, a beginning. Not an ending where everything suddenly becomes easy, but a beginning where everything becomes possible. Daniel knew that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. He'd still face judgment. He'd still encounter people and situations that demanded conformity. He'd still have to navigate a world that often punishes authenticity and rewards performance. But he also knew now that he could do it, that he could show up as his whole self, integrate all of his energies, and not just survive, but thrive. He'd proven it to himself in the most concrete way possible. The job was wonderful. The validation was meaningful. But the real victory was internal. Daniel had reclaimed himself. He'd freed the parts of himself he'd kept imprisoned. He'd chosen integration over fragmentation, authenticity over performance, truth over fear, and in doing so, he'd discovered something powerful. Life rewards wholeness, not because the world always understands or accepts it. Sometimes it doesn't. But because when you show up as your full, integrated, authentic self, you tap into a kind of power that performance can never access. You become magnetic. You become present. You become real. And reality, it turns out, is what the world has been starving for all along. Some transformations don't show on the outside, yet they change everything. Daniel looks the same as he did before that night. He still wears suits to work. He still presents, in many ways, in traditionally masculine fashion. To a casual observer, nothing has changed. But everything has changed. Because he's no longer performing, he's no longer fighting himself. He's no longer spending all his energy maintaining a mask that never quite fit. He shows up whole now, masculine and feminine, strong and soft, confident and vulnerable. All of it integrated, all of it real, all of it him. And that integration, that wholeness, has transformed not just his career, but his entire life. His relationships are deeper. His work is more meaningful. His presence is more powerful. Because he's finally present as himself. This is the truth about transformation that our culture rarely speaks. You don't become powerful by perfecting a performance. You become powerful by embracing all of who you are, by integrating the parts of yourself you've been taught to hide, by choosing authenticity over acceptance, truth over conformity, wholeness over fragmentation. Life rewards transformation, not because you become someone new, but because you become someone true. And when you become true, fully, completely, courageously true, everything shifts. The ground beneath your feet feels more solid. The air you breathe feels more real. The life you live becomes yours again. This is Daniel's story. But perhaps, in some way, it's all of our story. The invitation to stop performing and start living. To release the armor and embrace integration. To choose wholeness over fragmentation, even when it's terrifying. Even when the world demands conformity. Because in the end, the only person you really need to be is yourself. Your whole self. Your full, complex, beautiful, contradictory, integrated self. And that person is enough. That person has always been enough. That person is extraordinary, the end.
The gender diary exists to light that path with shared stories. Whether you found connection in this narrative, you're on your own journey of gender exploration, or you're here seeking understanding, your subscription fuels our mission. Every subscriber empowers us to keep illuminating these authentic experiences for our community. Kindly drop a comment below. Your voice adds to the tapestry of experiences that makes this space meaningful. Until our next story unfolds.